Presidents and the members of the committee. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon. I oppose this continuing resolution, which would shortchange our veterans, absolve the House Republican majority of their responsibility to govern, and move us closer to a shutdown. And I urge my colleagues to vote against it. The majority's proposal completely abandons our nation's veterans. We have been told by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Office of Management and Budget that $12 billion...
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I can barely hear her. If you...
Sure? Is that better? Okay. The majority's proposal completely abandons our nation's veterans. We've been told by the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Office of Management and Budget that $12 billion more is required to provide medical care for veterans who have been exposed to toxic substances. Despite those needs, the majority has decided to provide nothing for veterans' medical needs. I cannot understand how anybody could support this bill, go home to look their veteran constituents in the eye and tell them that they voted to shortchange the medical care they earned with their service. It is disgraceful. And we could have solved this issue had the majority considered a bipartisan path forward at any point during this entire process. But instead, just like last year, House Republicans squandered an entire year by taking us down a partisan path, forcing us to waste time considering extreme funding bills based on Trump's Project 2025 they could not pass and that have no chance of becoming law. 5 bills passed, 7 not. Couldn't even bring them to the floor. Just like last year, House Republicans' refusal to meet House Democrats at the table has left us without time to pass all 12 full-year appropriations bills before the end of September. And now, rather than admitting the inevitable defeat of their Project 2025 spending bills and passing a bipartisan bill to keep the government open while we finish our work, the majority proposes abandoning their obligation to govern, forcing a new Congress to clean up their mess, and they have included an extraneous, partisan, and controversial measure non-germane to appropriations that guarantees this continuing resolution will not become law. This bill will not pass the Senate. The president would veto it. This bill has no path to becoming law. A 6-month continuing resolution is a ploy to force the extreme Project 2025 manifesto agenda on the American people. They want to slash domestic investments in healthcare, education, job training, and every other discretionary program, which will hurt the middle class and the economy. The Republican majority believes a continuing resolution to the end of March provides them with more leverage to force their unpopular cuts to services that American families depend on to make ends meet. The majority knows that the fiscal year ends September 30th and that we cannot fund the government without the support of Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate. But for the second time in the 118th Congress, the majority does not want Congress to finish its work until March, nearly halfway through the fiscal year, wasting time, avoiding the inevitable, and failing to meet our obligations to the American people. A half-year continuing resolution is no way to govern. This is no way to serve the American people. The American people have a choice to make in November, and come January, we will have a new president and we will have a new Congress. While we presumably disagree on who we think will be leading our country and which side of the aisle will hold the gavels, we should agree that it is not right, not in the interests of the American people, for us to punt this year's work deep into next year for a different Congress and a different White House to be confronted with. We must pass a continuing resolution that allows us to finish our work before the new president and Congress are sworn in, and which addresses the immediate needs of the American families, workers, and veterans. A continuing resolution that ends in December, rather than one that lasts a half year, better serves our national security and our military readiness, veterans and their families, victims recovering from natural disasters, and all hard-working American taxpayers. Instead, the majority's bill fails our veterans. The majority's bill fails our military, putting government funding on autopilot for 6 months, which means the Department of Defense cannot execute its strategic priorities, such as investing in cutting-edge technologies and capabilities. Investments in our defense industrial base will be put on hold, including the submarine and shipbuilding bases. Over the weekend, Secretary Austin said in a letter, and I quote, "Asking the department to compete with the People's Republic of China, let alone manage conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, while under a lengthy continuing resolution, ties our hands behind our back while expecting us to be agile and to accelerate progress." He continued, the single most important thing that Congress can do to ensure U.S. national security is to pass timely legislation for all 12 appropriations bills for fiscal 2025. And I believe that every a member of the committee has received a letter from the Secretary of Defense in detail about what are the areas that would be held back if we move to a March 2025 bill. The majority's bill fails our seniors and Americans with disabilities on Social Security. No additional funding for the Social Security Administration's operating budget will result in reduced hours, closed field offices, and longer wait times for applicants and claims. The majority's bill fails the communities devastated by disasters by shortchanging emergency funds for FEMA. The bill provides nothing to address the dramatic collapse of the Key Bridge in Maryland, and nothing for block grants to help communities with the long-term recovery from devastating natural disasters from 2023, including the horrifying wildfires in Hawaii, the tornadoes across the country that devastated communities in places like Oklahoma. The majority fails low-income families, deprives them of support to achieve economic stability and well-being by halting payments for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Failure to extend TANF payments to states for the first 2 quarters of the fiscal year means Republicans are blocking more than $8 billion in reimbursements for state-run programs to help low-income families and children. And the majority is failing to live up to their own promises to the American people that they are capable of being entrusted to do the hard work of governing. They have unequivocally demonstrated they cannot. This bill is an admission that a House Republican majority cannot govern. They would rather gamble on an intervening election than attempt to complete their work on time. Let us hope the majority does not drive us straight to a Republican shutdown. But if they do shut down the government, I have no doubt the American people will know who is to blame.
Face it, a flood, a fire, or tornado, or hurricane, that's not red or blue. That just destroys the lives of our communities. I'm fighting for this FEMA funding because New Mexico has 2 disaster declarations, and my citizens, my constituents will be hurt. But you know what? I'm concerned about every state. Every state, every community deserves help. Looking around this room in Kentucky, there's a disaster declaration in Kentucky. They need help. Texas, they need help. New York, South Carolina, they'll all suffer if we don't fund FEMA shortfall. Representative DeLauro, can you describe what happens if we don't provide the full funding that's needed at FEMA now?
It really is pretty incredible. On Friday, last Friday, in my district in Seymour, Connecticut, where we had these flash flooding, and it wiped out a rail line. The structure underneath the rail lines just was washed away, and I went to visit the site with the emergency services, with people representing FEMA, et cetera. The fact is that without FEMA funds, they're going to be unable to address the issues and of restoring services. And there isn't, this is federal money for FEMA, which is, there are disasters, you pointed out, all over this country, whether it is in Hawaii or Oklahoma or Connecticut or New York or wherever, that if there was, I think, they've already deferred $6.1 billion because they don't have the money to be able to move forward on projects. This is not something that was created by a Democrat or a Republican or so forth. This is it's a disaster. It's Mother Nature doing something, and these communities are going to mightily suffer, whether or not they're individuals or whether or not they're businesses that are not going to be able to deal with the kinds of services that are necessary for them to continue. If without the money, FEMA cannot move forward. They need $24 billion. And my understanding in this bill, there's $10 billion. That is a very, very big difference in what we need in order to be able to go forward to meet the disaster relief issues that are facing
So less than
country.
half of what is needed. Republicans put in the continuing resolution less of half of what is needed.
right.
So which business do I say, you get help,
And
but
you
I'm
don't.
sorry, on the other side of the street, your neighbor is not. When we are going to be working neighbors to neighbor, community to community, we must cover everybody. No matter where you live, whether it is in South Carolina or in New Mexico or in Connecticut or in Kentucky.
We've had a disaster, emergency disaster declaration. Towns like Seymour, Oxford, Monroe, all of these places are just trying to figure out how they're going to be able to build back. And without FEMA, they're not able to build back.
And it is just a helping hand that FEMA is coming up. It's just, it's the kind of thing you do expect government to do. When there is that kind of disaster, what kind of helping hand can you expect? And our federal law says we will provide it. But once again, it is Congress's job to fund the government, to fund our promises, to fund the PACT Act, to pass the Farm Bill. We haven't done that. So all the things we should be doing that we are not doing, and instead focusing on items that are not essential in this moment.
Well, I think there's a point also with regard to defense funding, and that, you know, this is acute national security threats that we are faced with. And I won't go into chapter and verse because the Secretary's letter does that. But each of the services impacted under the 6-month CR, the Army, delaying development of next-generation squad weapon, lethal semi-autonomous aerial unmanned systems, and the Navy delays space and electronic warfare engineering programs. Air Force delays B-21 progress, initial operational capability. So this is a reality. You know, ranking on labor HHS, not on defense, and the material is coming from the Department of Defense with a reality of what happens with a 6-month continuing resolution. And, you know, a point made earlier at a different time was that if you only wanted to fund defense and not do everything else, that was absolutely the wrong thing to do because we were all dependent on one another in terms of the overall security of this country. Now we're talking about if this were so important, it would have been done in another way, and let's blame the United States Senate. Look, I'm not one that carries a lot of water for what goes on in the United States Senate with some areas, but I'll be, you know, this is not the Senate's fault. This is the fault of this body here with a failure to govern, a failure to pass the bills that we could have been passing all along. We've done it before. I chaired this committee, and I've watched tough, hard negotiations, week after week, month after month, until we were able to come to a conclusion, and we did it in December. We didn't carry over until the following year. It was with Senator Shelby, with Senator Leahy, with Congresswoman Granger, and myself. We made a decision to get it done and not carry it over. It can be done. There's got to be a willingness to get it done. And my view, that willingness is not here at the moment.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. And I believe that this issue of needing to work things on that hard work and hard bipartisan work, I've enjoyed listening to the appropriators talk about how it was done in the past on that hard bipartisan work together. And if there's not anything, is there anything else you'd like to point out? I happen to be the last Democrat, so is there anything else you want to mention at this time?
I think we've made the point with regard to veterans. It's the clarity of that. The military piece, there's real clarity overall with that. I think the FEMA issue, these are the big issues that are coming out of this bill. And above all, we all know that you have to have Democrats and Republicans at the table to hammer out the bills so that in the final analysis, the president signs the bill. Otherwise, the government shuts down. That's not what happens with other pieces of legislation. That happens with the appropriations bills and with the funding bills. We can come together. We have in the past. There is no doubt in my mind that if there is a willingness to do it, let's do it. We can get started and we can make it happen by mid-December and going forward.
Thank you for your optimism, Ranking Member DeLauro. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And I would yield to Mr. Norman.
Mr. Lawyer, you mentioned national security threat.
Yeah.
Is the invasion at the border a national security threat?
I'm talking about what's here in this bill in terms of defense funding and commenting on the letter. I don't know if you received a copy of Secretary Austin's letter, where he outlines very, very clearly what the downside is if we, to the military and to our national security.
No, is our national security under attack by the invasion at the border, yes or no?
Well, I don't know. I don't understand what your question is in relation to. Are you talking about?
You said this was a national security threat if we didn't pass.
This CR.
Let me just, I'll let you finish. Look, can I just ask the question?
Sure, go ahead.
You,
Go right ahead.
I just caught the tail end of you saying this not funding
The Defense Department.
Defense Department through, I guess you're wanting through the end of this year.
Yeah.
Was a national security threat. Is the invasion at the border a national security threat?
I don't understand what that has to do with the continuing
Oh, really?
resolution. Yeah. What does it have to do with the continuing resolution? Your continuing resolution. This is a one corner, the Republican House majority. The Senate hasn't participated
The national
in this.
security threat has everything to do with the funding. The national security threat, that invasion at the border that your administration has saddled us with is a threat to this whole system of
Well,
government.
let me-
And let me just tell you this.
Well, go ahead.
The fact that we are putting the SAVE Act with this to verify whether you're a citizen or not, I think has a lot to do with the integrity of this country and our voting system.
Well, I would just say to you that if you're very, very concerned about the border security issue, then you would have been able to pass the bipartisan bill that came out of the United States Senate.
That's not true.
That's
not true.
The Border Patrol.
You were
Border
15, it was
Security-
15,000 per day. That was a farce, just to get, and you know
I'm
that.
focused on this continuing resolution.
I get that.
And the lack of, where the Defense Department has told us that the shortfall and the inconsistency for them over the next 6 months have real problems in terms of our national security.
The inconsistency of particularly Lloyd Austin, he is a national security threat by what he's allowed to happen to this country. He hadn't spoken one word up on the invasion that's happened at the border. And for you to sit here and say this is a national security threat when you and your party have allowed 15 million in this country is a travesty. And the American people are going to hold you accountable for it. Mr. Harris, would you give me your take on our national security threat and what's happened the last 4.5 years under this administration?
Well, I mean, clearly the southern border is a national security threat. We know it on a daily basis. We see it on our TVs. The American people see it on their TVs. That's why the American people actually strongly support the SAVE Act. They think it's just common sense that you actually should put in place. You know, the issue was that we already have a law in place. In fact, the gentleman from South Carolina, I think, fully understands that law is not very clear because the establishment of intent is unclear in the law. So, for instance, if you go into the Department of Motor Vehicles in the state of Maryland and you are an illegal, because an illegal alien can own a car, they can get a driver's license, they can do that. You sit at a computer screen and a screen flashes up and says, well, do you want to register to vote?
So
All
when
they
you,
have to do is they have to push yes. And there is no, the DMV person, and I know because I did this a couple times, DMV, they don't come and say, oh, but you know, you have to be an American citizen, or you have to be this. They're not going over the rules with you. So in fact, the way it's established, the way some states have established voter registration, allows the illegal alien to register to vote, perhaps without intending to do it, to break the law. The SAVE Act fills in the loophole. Again, it's a belts and suspenders approach. The American people expect it because of the reports of people voting illegally.
is it accountability?
Yeah, look, the fact of the matter is that there are states who push back against it because I think, honestly, some states don't mind if illegal aliens vote in federal elections.
Well, when you check the box, what the SAVE Act does is puts penalties in place for those who bypass it, ignore it, overlook it. And you know, we got 15 million here that my good friends on the other aisle don't want any accountability for. They just want you to say there is no problem. I think it's constitutional, isn't it, that you have to be an American citizen to vote?
It absolutely is. Again, it's a belt and suspenders approach, and I'll correct the gentleman. We don't have 15 million people here illegally. We probably have well over 20 million now because we have 10 million just in the last 3.5 years.
And I will tell you what came alive with me the past 2 weeks. You realize there are over 320,000 children, unaccompanied minors, that are into God knows what. Put it into football perspectives. Each state football stadium holds around 85,000. That's 4 stadiums of children in this country, Mr. Lario, of your administration, letting in this country without a parent, without knowing the language, to fend for themselves. That is a travesty. I yield back.
If I might, you
yes,
asked-
yes, ma'am.
You
Well,
asked the question.
I've
Well,
yielded back,
I'll
but-
ask the chair, yeah, I apologize.
Lario, please.
Because there's one piece in this. This is on unmanned aircraft systems and the authority for that. Allowing the authorities, this is coming from, allowing authorities to lapse would weaken the nation's overall security posture, leaving critical infrastructure, public spaces more exposed to drone-related threats. Additionally, it would provide transnational criminal organizations with more opportunities to use drones to evade detection and carry out illegal activities across borders.
What's your point?
The point is that there are systems that are not going to be able to be utilized that could potentially address what you are talking about in terms
They
of
utilized the balloon from China. They utilized that, didn't they? The balloon
Sir,
from China that was utilized.
I was responding to your issue of dealing with the border. This is something that would deal with it, and it is
If you wanted to
eliminated.
deal with the border, you would have done it 4.5 years ago. You didn't do
Don't talk to
it.
me about dealing with
You
the
wanted
border.
to let the 15 million in, but to keep power. It's not going to work this time.
You know, my friend, I have acknowledged a border crisis. We've had opportunities to deal with it. We had opportunities. I've been here for a while. I can remember when Senator McCain and others
Today.
came together.
Today.
They came together to put forward a immigration reform, and it was the House at the time, House Republicans, who rejected it in the same way that House Republicans have rejected it in this past year when former President Trump said to folks in the majority, don't do it, don't give Biden a win. If you're really serious about
All
it,
right.
you would have
If
taken on that
Biden
bill.
if
Thank
Biden
you.
wanted to win, he would have
Thank you.
finished the wall and stopped
Thank
it.
you.
He's the
Well-
one that opened it up, and you know it, and children
Go
are
on.
suffering.
All right,
Yes,
all right.
you made them
Let's
suffer
take a
when you
breath.
separated them from their families.
I'm going to recognize Mr. Roy.
I thank the gentlelady, I thank the chair. Mr. Harris, is there any anything that stops Congress from passing an appropriations bill at any point after a CR is adopted that would, whether it's an omnibus appropriations bill or all 12 appropriations bills? In other words, if a CR is adopted of any length, whether it be 3 months or a year, can Congress continue to do its work, pass appropriations bills, and override the CR?
Well, the gentleman makes a good point. You don't override the CR. The CR actually has an expiration date for funding, just like our expiration date for funding right now is September 30th, yet we pass appropriations bills in June. In fact, just to correct the record on the VA, and somehow Republicans don't care about veterans, that's the first bill we brought to the floor, June 6th. And it passed the House on a party line vote. That means that every Republican voted, and by the way, the amount for VA medical care funding was at the president's budget request.
Right.
It went to the Senate where it has languished for 3 months. So if we're worried about who cares about veterans and who doesn't, I suggest you call Mr. Schumer up and say, hey, remember that bill we sent over there on June 7th, because we passed it on the 6th, it went over there on the 7th, and it sat there. The fact of the matter is, it's just that it's an expiration date. It's not the date you have to pay. I mean, we don't have to pass those bills on March 28th. We could pass them in December. We could pass them in November. We could pass them in January. In fact, if the Senate begins to do its job and conference with us, pass some of the bills on the floor, we sent 5 over, that we sent 4, because I think Homeland Security is still over here, because Senate refuses to take up a real border bill, H.R. 2, not the phony one that was put up in the Senate. If the Senate takes up those 4 bills that are over there, we could conference them next week. We could answer all these defense questions, all these things that the gentlelady brings up, the ranking member brings up. We could address all of them in a negotiation on the House-passed defense appropriations bill, because it's been sitting in the Senate. The Senate hasn't even brought their defense appropriations bill to the floor. Now, again, I will reiterate, Mr. Austin seems to have misplaced the criticism here. The criticism should be on the Senate not doing the job it should be doing with the defense appropriations bill.
And so, just putting a finer point on that, the debate about a expiration date on the CR, in this case, March 28th, is really just a debate about when we're putting the pressure point, right? It's not a debate about whether or not the appropriations bills can ultimately get finished or not. That is a separate question. We have 5 appropriations bills that we've passed. We have 4 that are sitting in the Senate. The Senate has passed how many bills, to the best of the gentleman's knowledge?
None off the floor.
0. And so the House has passed 4. We have a 5th that's sitting at the desk. We have others that we've been debating. We've gotten them out of committee. So then the question is the gentleman aware, 4 times in basically my lifetime since the mid-1970s have we passed appropriations bills, 12 appropriations bills on time? Is that correct?
It was before my time here. Since my time here, we have never passed all 12 bills on time.
Right. And how often, rarely do we pass 12 independent appropriations bills even late, correct? Normally it's an omnibus or a CR. I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying that's the way we've been doing things. Is that correct?
That is, and the gentleman wasn't here when I mentioned that earlier in my testimony. That is the way we do it. That's not the way it's supposed to be done.
Right.
But now the expectation here is that you don't pass an individual appropriations bill, no matter how important defense is or the VA is. You put them on a shelf somewhere until you get a minibus or an omnibus. That's not the way it's meant to be.
So
but
without
you're absolutely right.
just a nonpartisan question, House's fault, Senate's fault, Democrats' fault, Republicans' fault, are we going to pass 12 appropriations bills in any way, shape, or form by September 30th? Independently.
I don't believe we will.
On either side.
But again, there are 4 bills. The claim is the Republicans haven't done their job. We've done our job on 4 bills that sit over there. And I'll remind the gentleman that those 4 bills total up to more than half the spending. Had those bills been processed by the Senate, gone to conference, and come back to the floor,
then we'd be in a
we'd
position
have
to
a CR
potentially
that's
do
half
a
as
smaller CR, having done those appropriations. I agree. But point being, whoever's fault. Again, the Senate has passed 0 appropriation bills. We've passed 5, 4, 1 held at the desk, 4 sitting in the Senate. It is unlikely that we're going to have the 12 independent bills passed and signed into law by September 30th. Is that a fair statement?
that's a very fair statement.
And the gentlelady is nodding in agreement, correct?
Of course.
Right. Again, regardless of fault. So my point of saying that is, to those that question the CR. I don't like CRs. I don't like CRs as a way of doing business. But we've got to figure out what to do with one in this context, in this environment. So then the question becomes, what's the expiration date? Question for the gentlelady. You expressed earlier, I think, I just want to make sure I understand for the record, that you think it ought to expire on a shorter time. I think December.
December.
Is that didn't you posit that earlier?
The way we've done this in the past, in terms of the negotiation, we were able to sort out the differences by, mid to later, but in December, getting it done before the end of the calendar.
Okay, and do you know, just for purposes of trying to figure out what that would look like, right, in terms of putting together what would be almost certainly an omnibus, right, probably not 12 independent bills, then in addition, what would be the likelihood, do you know what the timing is of Ukraine expiration and whether that would be a part of the discussion on the funding?
I think that we're talking about the bills that are currently before the body that we have, as you pointed out.
Right.
There are 5 bills that have been passed. There are additional 7 that still need to be. One would have to be sitting down with the view of getting it done in the way that we have done in the past, and that means hard negotiations. And what we did the last time in terms of doing this, and it was still carried over to March, you've got to be done with the extraneous, non-germane riders that are part of the bills. You've got to focus in on what the FRA said in terms of an increase of 1% for defense and an increase of 1% for non-defense. If we follow the rules of the road, we could get this done in short order.
So, but it would be an omnibus, almost certainly.
An omnibus, a minibus, et cetera.
And
We're not
so,
going to do
right.
individual bills.
Which is one of those things. It goes back to my point about timing, right? It goes to my point about picking the date. We pick dates, just for the average viewer out there, we pick dates based typically on a pressure point. We don't pick, because you can always pass the appropriations bills. We can pass them tomorrow. We could do an omnibus in December, even if we have a March date or a full year CR. I personally would rather just have a 1-year CR. Just set it, go ahead and fund it, and then we could debate it. But the reason I think the gentlelady's shaking her head, and there are others, is that if you don't set the date at a certain date to try to trigger, we're going to run out of money, then there's not a pressure point. And the reason typically it's done in December is not like, some joy, we want to get this done before the next calendar year. Our fiscal year is September 30th. It's because it's Christmas.
Well, we should have done it by September 30th, and we could have.
But it's always done, but the Senate's passed 0. Let's go back to that. Again, not casting blame. I'm talking here for the good of the country. I'm trying to figure out, because Americans scratch their head, and they go, what are you doing? And then you look up, and whatever always happens. So let's go back to the Ukraine question. The reason I asked the question to my gentleman, my friend from Maryland, did we not start the Ukraine funding with basically a $45 billion funding in December on an omnibus 2 years ago, before we had the plus up this last spring?
Yes.
And so if you're an average American sitting out there going, well, do I want a CR that is expiring on, say, December 15th, setting up a pre-Christmas pressure point wherein we are deciding how to fund government for the rest of this fiscal year, right before Christmas, and the question of Ukraine funding expiration is now out in the press, that it's going to be running out of money by the end of the year? Would there not be a potential pressure for there to be a grand bargain of significant spending in an omnibus spending in December, along with potentially another large pot of money for Ukraine? Would the gentleman from Maryland agree that, based on your experience in this town, that is not an insignificant likelihood if a CR is put till December 15th?
It's not only an insignificant likelihood, but it disenfranchises the idea of coming back in a lame duck session, disenfranchises the American voters who will have made a decision in the beginning of November, perhaps to take this country in a different direction. And to me, that's the reason why, again, we don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be, but let's set the deadline into the next administration, into the next Congress, because I think that's just fair for the American voters. They're going to make a big decision this fall, and it would be a shame if this Congress, in a lame duck session, did things like that. Again, with the pressure of a debt ceiling, with the pressure of a Ukraine funding, with the pressure of Israeli funding. I mean, you could do the whole laundry list. What it does is it allows a lame duck legislature to make major decisions, and I think that's just not right for the American people.
I agree. So let me move then off of the spending issue to the SAVE Act issue. Is the gentleman from Maryland aware that in Texas on August 26th, they announced the removal of 6,500 non-citizens from the voter rolls? In Virginia in August, the Attorney General announced 6,303 non-citizens. Since 2014, Virginia has removed 11,000 non-citizens. Alabama has removed 3,251. Ohio just announced 597. And I could go on and on down the list of states. North Carolina, 1,454. But importantly, is it not true that under current law, the way the courts have applied the NVRA, that if you are a state like Arizona and you say, we believe and have passed a law saying we want to ensure documentary proof of citizenship to ensure that only citizens vote in American elections, that in the case of Arizona, the courts have said, sorry, you can't do that for federal elections because the courts have interpreted it as violating the NVRA because the NVRA sets out certain documents and materials that you can collect. So in other words, the federal law has been interpreted by federal judges to prohibit states from ensuring the enforcement of the law that non-citizens not vote, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle present to the American people as an already established fact. Is it not also true that it's an already established fact of law that you're not supposed to be here illegally? But yet we have 20 million people here. Is a gentleman agree that that is a problem that the SAVE Act sets out to address?
So, and again, given the way motor voter registration occurs in Maryland, I wouldn't be surprised if there were thousands of illegal aliens in Maryland who were registered to vote and who should be taken off the rolls. But the upshot is that Congress thought that a belt was enough, and the courts said it's not. We're going to have to put suspenders on this too, and that's what the SAVE Act does. It clarifies the law so that the court cannot go to a state like they did in Arizona and say you can't do this. I think that clarification needs to be made because there are states who care about whether or not illegal aliens vote in elections.
One other question. So we had 143 of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle opposed a bill to overturn the District of Columbia's law allowing illegal aliens to vote in local elections. Now, that's D.C. We have authority over D.C. as Congress. So we put legislation before. Now, 52 Democrats voted for it. I mean, I'll give credit where it's due. But 100 to this point about, well, it's already illegal to vote as a non-citizen. But yet we have 143 Democrats who are leaning into wanting to allow D.C. to have illegal aliens not just vote, but were being recruited to vote, targeted to vote in what you would call the local elections for D.C. So is it not true that we have jurisdictions across the country, San Francisco, Oakland, D.C., like I just mentioned, New York, and other places, that have been actively seeking to recruit and register non-citizens for claim to be state and local elections? So now you're doing that, and then at the same time saying, don't worry, it's against the law, but just trust me in terms of the voters for the federal elections. Is that not the state of things, and is that not what the SAVE Act sets to address?
So that's right. It creates an administrative nightmare. So, for instance, there are jurisdictions in Maryland that want 16-year-olds to vote in local elections, especially school board elections. But you can imagine, I mean, we talk about a voter roll, but in fact, you'd have to keep multiple voter rolls. And we know that some states are better than others at keeping voter rolls with integrity. So it sets a standard that is necessary, and again, that the American people expect. They do not expect a person who crossed the border illegally to have a say in federal elections.
So last question for the gentleman of Maryland, and I'll yield back my time, because it has been raised an issue about the timing of the SAVE Act and whether it would have an impact on this election. And let me share the concerns raised by my friend from Kentucky and others about, how this plays out in terms of timing. And, lack of joy of saying that we're at a place where we haven't passed 12 appropriations bills. I wish we had. I wish we weren't doing a CR like we always do. But we are where we are. And so the question here with respect to the SAVE Act and timing, would the gentleman agree, by and large, I'll posit some things that I think is important for everybody to know, is that the bill would be effective upon enactment, is the way it's drafted, that it will still be effective because a number of states, 22 states, allow for election day registration. So we got to keep in mind, people say, well, people are already registered. Well, that assertion is correct that a lot of states have already registration, in dates that have already passed, but we have same day registration in certain states. We have a significant impact where there's other states that have expired. For example, Nevada is same day. North Carolina, I think, is same day registration permitted during early voting. Pennsylvania has 15 days before the election. In other words, there's still a lot of time between now and election day with respect to those issues. Does the gentleman agree that that's important in the consideration with respect to timing?
I would agree, and not only that, there is no bad time to do this, because, again, the American people actually think that the protections are in place so that illegal aliens are not voting in our federal elections, and the fact of the matter, which the gentleman from Texas has brought up, due to the Arizona ruling, indicates that those protections are not really in place. So there is no bad time to do it. This should have been done. Honestly, it should have been taken up by the Senate when it was passed, when this bipartisan bill, and remember, this was passed on a bipartisan basis. When it was sent over to the Senate, shame on the Democrat majority in the Senate. They should have taken it up. And again, I will reiterate, I suspect they didn't because it actually could pass, because an overwhelming majority of Americans agree with the idea that people in this country illegally should not be voting in a federal election.
And the gentleman is aware that the legislation requires states to remove non-citizens for their existing roles through the election. So in other words, if we were to pass this into law by the September 30th deadline, we will have funded the United States government, including our men and women in uniform, and including all the things that are concerned about through March 28th, giving time for a new election to have transpired and a new set of priorities to be established, not doing it during the lame duck. And we would have set up a situation in which we'd have the SAVE Act, which is supported, the issue is supported by 80+% of the American people, and it would then give time still to, and require, to clean non-citizens from their existing roles through the election, and the tools, it gives them access to databases they don't currently have a requirement and access to have access to. And so I think that's an important piece of this, in addition to additional penalties for federal employees and state and local election officials that register non-citizens to vote. It enhances those penalties so that you can make sure that we have a belief in our elections. Final point that has been made about the VA, for the gentleman from Maryland, is it not true that we basically have the VA secretary saying we have more people applying for this than we thought, so that those of us who had raised concerns when the PACT Act was passed, and we were saying this was going to create a system that was going to be very difficult to predict and administer, and raise those issues, and even some of us voted against and didn't want to vote against because we have constituents suffering from burn pit harm, but we said this is going to be a problem. And now are we not sitting here looking at the piper being here that has to be paid, and this is the problem? Would the gentleman agree with that? And then I'll yield back.
Well, I do, and that's why the Congress, in its wisdom, has $112 billion in advanced appropriation to do this. So this